Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to our webinar on the topic Reducing Youth Offending, Evidence from 3 New Systematic Reviews. It's really nice to see so many of you here. We are here today to talk about the evidence from 3 new systematic reviews that aims to look at the impact of sports programs, wilderness and outdoor adventure programs, and mentoring programs, and to see how these programs can keep children and young people safe from involvement in violence. So before we begin, would be good to do a quick round of introductions of myself and the panel. I'll start. My name is Nayyara Tabassum. I work as Senior Research Manager from the Youth Endowment Fund. I have a background of working in what works centers, and I'm very interested in finding out what works, what does not work, and knowledge translation. I lead our work on systematic reviews. So we have 3 panelists who will be presenting on the systematic reviews today that they led on reducing youth violence and offending very soon. If I could please ask you to introduce yourselves. On my screen, I have Suchi first, then Ashima, and then Monisha. Suchi, if you could please introduce yourself briefly.
Hello everyone, I'm Suchi Malhotra. I'm Evidence Synthesis Specialist in Campbell, South Asia. I will be presenting sports interventions results. Next one.
Thanks, Suchi. Over to you, Ashima.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashima and I work with the Evidence and Synthesis team with Campbell. I will be presenting results from the wilderness and adventure therapy interventions for young people.
Thanks, Ashima. And finally, over to you, Monisha.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monisha. I work as a consultant with Campbell South Asia. Today, I will be presenting the findings of a mixed methods review for mentoring interventions for children and youth who have already offended or who are at risk for offending. Thank you.
Thanks, Monisha. We have a great panel with us today. And the way how we've organized this webinar is, first, I'll start by introducing who the Youth Endowment Fund are as an organization, why we commissioned these 3 systematic reviews, and how we'll be using them. And after this, we'll have the 3 presentations. The first presentation will be by Suchi on sports. The second one will be by Ashima on outdoor wilderness interventions. And the last one will be by Monisha on mentoring. Because we have limited time, we'll have a discussion at the end of the final presentation. But do keep your questions coming in. Do put your questions in the chat and I'll monitor those and we'll discuss them at the end. In the meantime, I thought it would be very helpful to give a brief overview of the Youth Endowment Fund and why we fund systematic reviews. So the Youth Endowment Fund are an independent charity with a grant from the UK Home Office. We are a what works centre with an aim to prevent serious youth violence. We use research to identify effective approaches to support children and young people. About a year ago, we commissioned Campbell Collaboration to find out what the evidence looks like on these 3 programs, namely sports, outdoor wilderness programs, and mentoring programs. I'm a huge advocate for mixed method systematic reviews, and because they provide a fuller picture about the impact of these programs and how they work. So today we have the findings from these 3 mixed method systematic reviews, and we are here today to talk about their effectiveness in how they keep children and young people safe from involvement in violence. We'll also find out more about how these programs work, what elements of these programs work, what does not work when it comes to reducing youth offending and violence. So just a background about the Youth Endowment Fund and our strategy. As I mentioned earlier, we are a what works centre with an aim to preventing serious youth violence. We use research to identify effective approaches to support children and young people. To try and achieve our mission, we do 3 things. We identify promising approaches and fund good work. The second thing we do is invest in rigorous evaluation and research to find out what works. So this includes things like peer-led research to understand the lives of young people. And the third thing we do is work for change by scaling up effective programs and sharing the findings from our research. Our work depends on collaborating with experts, and it would not be possible without our crucial partnerships and coalitions with the youth sector, education, police, and local authorities. I lead the Youth Endowment Fund's team in focusing on finding what works. We focus on systematic reviews as a core part of our strategy in making evidence-based knowledge accessible and to tell us about the effectiveness of interventions to prevent serious youth violence. A bit about our process. During the process of a systematic review, we have several layers of engagement with practitioners, academics, and young people with lived experience so that we make sure our reviews are informed by practical experiences on the ground. This process slide captures some of the layers of involvement of stakeholders during the systematic review process. I'm going to break down briefly each of the layers to give you an overview of what's involved in each systematic review. As you know, the first layer is the steps of a systematic review. Here's a relatively simplistic model, which I know you're all familiar with, but it gives a bit of a high-level overview on the 4 steps of a systematic review. The first step is clarifying the problem and the question, engaging with stakeholders, forming the review team, developing the framework. The second step is finding studies within the scope. The third step is appraising the quality of evidence. And the final step is engaging with stakeholders to interpret and how we make use of the evidence. The second layer involves expert panels consisting of practitioners and academics who are invited together to comment on the review at 3 different stages, usually at the TRF stage, then at the protocol stage, and finally when we get to the findings. The third layer is having separate independent peer reviewers who review the systematic review. So in addition to Campbell's own process of peer reviewers and YEF's internal quality appraisal process, we also have a separate peer review process after we get the final review. And we usually have one subject matter expert, usually from criminology, and a technical expert who does the peer reviews. The final layer is including a youth voice of young people with lived experiences of violence and offending. And we usually try to take feedback from our YEF's Youth Advisory Board, and they comment on the practical ways of how these programs work, their views and perspectives on these programs. After we get the results, we'll publish the systematic reviews on our website. We usually we'll use it to inform 2 of our other research products, namely the YEF Evidence and Gap Map and the YEF Toolkit. The Evidence and Gap Map is the world's largest resource of 2,000 studies on what works to keep children safe from involvement in violence. It tells you where the evidence exists and where the gaps are. It's useful for researchers, policy analysts, or academics. It's also quite technical, which is why we developed the YEF Toolkit. The toolkit is an accessible online resource for people who work with and commission services for children and young people. It aims to support you to use the evidence in your decision-making and in your work. The toolkit doesn't really give guarantees on what prevents youth violence, but it does give you a sense of what are the best bets, what interventions or programs have worked well in the past. And it helps YEF both internally in deciding which programs we fund and externally in influencing policy. So this is what the front page of the toolkit looks like. You'll see about 17 different approaches, each with their own summary card. And based on the findings from these systematic reviews, we update the toolkit. And the toolkit shows 3 pieces of information for each topic. So on the right-hand side, we provide an estimate of the average impact on protecting children against involvement in violence. And in the middle of these 3 ratings, we have our evidence rating, which reflects how much confidence we have in the impact. On the left-hand side, we provide a cost rating, which gives you a sense of the likely cost of the approach. So that is the front page of the toolkit. If you access this online, you can scroll down and explore some of the other approaches. When you click on any of the summary cards, you can see a narrative description of the intervention and further descriptions about this approach. Both the YEF toolkit and the evidence and gap map are up on our website if you'd like to explore it on your own. So hopefully this gives you an overview of why we commissioned these reviews and how and why we plan to use these reviews for both our internal and external influencing purposes. The 3 new reviews that will be presented today will be used to update the toolkit, the evidence and gap map, and it'll help us in informing policy and practice in the kinds of programs we fund as an organization and how we influence policy. The purpose of the 3 presentations in today's session is to share the findings from these reviews and get your thoughts and valuable suggestions on the effectiveness of these programs in reducing youth offending and violence. I will now be handing over to Suchi for her first presentation on the effectiveness of sports programs and what the review team found on what works and what does not work. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll let Suchi present and share her screen. The first presentation is for 10 minutes. And during the presentation, if you have any points to discuss, please raise your hands or put your questions in the chat. I'll monitor the chat and we'll take those questions at the very end. So over to you, Suchi, if you could present your slides.
Yeah, thank you. Just I'm sharing my, hope it's.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I will be presenting the effects of sports and physical activity interventions in for at-risk and offending children and young people on behavioral, psychosocial, and offending outcomes. This is a mixed method systematic review. So, like, first of all, obviously, I want to acknowledge the funder, Youth Endowment Fund, for this review, and also the team members, which is Howard, Hannah, myself, Ashima, and Monisha. And we also want to acknowledge the contribution of our information specialist, John Nayyara. I will tell you the overview of this systematic review. So we have seen that like even though in 13 years, I've seen an 80% reduction in youth offending, but the major drive of this falls are pre-court diversional activities by the police and youth offending teams. We also see that even though they were like youth offending teams and others refer you to a variety of activities, and one of them is like sports intervention. So youth at risk were engaged into different interventions, and sports intervention is one of them. So we want, like with this review, we want to see how effective is this sports and a physical activity interventions for at-risk children and youth aged up to 25 years in changing anti-social behavior and offending outcomes, including serious violence. We, in terms of objectives, secondly, we also want to see what are their effects on the intermediate outcomes, such as time use and psychosocial outcomes that affects antisocial behavior and offending outcomes. It's a mixed method systematic review, so we also see what are the success factors and barriers that affects the implementation of sports and physical activity intervention program for at-risk children and youth. Fourth, we also have this one of the objectives, like also see the cost effectiveness of sports intervention for at-risk children and youth aged up to 25 years. When we talked about the peak of this review, it's like the participants, as I said, it's like children and youth aged up to 25 years who have been exhibited like at risk or deemed at risk or antisocial and violent, or who already have offending. Second, in terms of intervention, it's all, we have included sports and physical activity based interventions. Plus, we also include sports plus intervention, where sports is used as a hook and providing also additional activities such as counseling, social skills training, basic education. In terms of outcomes, our main outcome is primary outcome is like to see a behavioral psychosocial offending outcome, such as aggression, antisocial behavior, offending and violent crime. And the intermediate outcome that we really want to see is like values, attitude, beliefs, sporting ability, attachment to the team, club and sports. We also want to see from our quantitative, qualitative data refers to barriers and facilitators such as participation rates. In cost effectiveness, we want to see if this intervention is cost effective and like cost benefits. It's a mixed method reviews, like we also have like experimental design, non-experimental design, and we also include process evaluation, qualitative studies, plus cost effectiveness studies. When we talked about this review, like in Prisma, we actually found 3,658 studies. But then when we just screen it, because that's how we did it, like we screened studies into 2 parts. So when we screen for title after screening, we actually screened 3,000 plus number. But in full text, we only screened 7,739 numbers, sorry. The final number that we included in this review, the finding of the numbers, is like it's mixed method system study, we got 4, effectiveness studies, we got 18, and process evaluation was 38. So I will be presenting what was the result from all the studies that we included in. So we got only 4 experimental design studies, which is like a randomized control trial. There were like 18 studies, which is non-experimental, quasi-experimental studies. And we got 42 process evaluation and qualitative studies and 2 cost analysis studies. When we see the region-wise of the in the findings, When we see like, there were like 43% of the studies are like as from North America, and then 37% are from Europe and Central Asia. And there were very minimum number, like only 2% of the studies we got from Middle East and North Africa among 60 total numbers. When we critically appraise it, that's one of the things, like when we find the findings, we got the evidence of, we actually see that 90% of the studies, like overall confidence is low. Only 10% of the studies are of like high quality in terms of the effectiveness studies that we got. When we see the critical appraisal of process evaluation, the quality, how confident are we see 86% of the studies overall confidence is low, and 7% of the studies are of medium confidence, and 7 studies are of high confidence level. What the findings that we got from these studies? We actually see that the larger moderate have significant effects on offending, aggression, and both in externalizing, internalizing behavior. We see that they are moderate or large effects from our sports interventions. But in all the cases, there were like only a small number of studies were included, and all with a low confidence study findings. When we see our quantitative studies, like the result of our effectiveness and non-experimental studies, we see there were no significant effects on social skills. They are pro-social peers and pro-social behaviors. There's no significant effects on self-esteem. There's no significant effects on academic achievement from a small number of studies. These are we got from our meta-analysis. There's no quantitative estimates on time use, like division or relationship with the adult. But these were identified as important in the qualitative data, like qualitative synthesis. These were the quantitative synthesis that we found. In offending, aggression, externalizing behavior, and internalizing behavior, we see that they were like a large and a moderate effects. But the number of studies were like only, like there were like 6 studies that we got from offending and aggression. In externalizing, we got 8 studies which talked about it, but internalizing behavior, there were only 5 studies that we found. And then they were all low confidence studies. But we see the large effects and moderate effects of sports interventions in reducing antisocial behaviors and offending. In terms of delinquent peers, there was like only 1 study that we found which talked about how delinquent peers. Then in intermediate outcome, which was like a pro-social behavior, we say social skills, self-esteem, academic achievement, does not get any effect from the sports interventions. Time use and adult relationship, we don't get any evidence from which supports that this is in quantitative studies, we don't get it, but qualitative data strongly support this effects. The time use and the diversion actually helped youth not to be engaged in antisocial behavior and or a crime, which is like because they were diverted and they have used their time in sports intervention. And also adult relationship, how the relationship with the coach actually helped them to reduce the antisocial behavior and offending outcomes. When we see the delinquency, that's one of the things, like I said, we for the meta-analysis, we actually use the 3-level meta-analytical model. And the effect size of delinquent behavior, these were the number of studies that we included. And it's actually said that there is a large level of effects of the sports intervention in reducing the delinquency. And the same thing that we in aggression also, we say that there was an effect size of aggression, and it's actually showing, if you see the dimension, it's actually saying desirable effects. Sports intervention were effective in reducing the aggression also. But I said that we found evidence on it, but then in qualitative synthesis, we actually use a theory-based systematic framework where we see how this helps the qualitative synthesis. The first thing that we actually see is there any barriers and facilitator to participation, which actually explain that there's an iteration or not. They were actually natural iteration. When the youth were involved in the sports program, they were move out because of injury or time constraint, or any sports club have discontinued the program. And there's also one which is which also said that progression, they have actually taken another sports program, or they were so much involved that they've actually followed the same sports in regular club. And they've also a third thing that we also see sanctions. So children, youth may be required to leave for a bad behavior, either in the program, because there were a lot of programs that have been conducted in schools and also in community settings, or they've actually expelled the students. And there was also a temporary suspension from games has been resulted in the child youth to leave the program. And in some of the findings, we also see that the youth also said that they lost the interest. They are not very engaged into sports. They don't like playing sports now. So they've lost interest in the program. and what program features, because this is very important thing that we found in from a qualitative synthesis, that they were like what features that actually attract youth to be involved into the program, and they were part of that intervention, is like they find sport as like it's fun, and they really like playing with it. So like people say, I really enjoy it, I really want to be like, it's actually pushed me to the limit. That's one of the participants has actually said. It's also career advancement. They were like so much influenced by the coach that they really want to get into coaching job. They really want to get into as an employment. And then there was like something to do, which is like a diversion. And then they said like it's time use, because nothing, they were not doing anything. They were like bored, like it's like boredom theory as well. It plays that they were not very much engaged into sports, and that leads to, because they have a lot of time and they were involved into antisocial peers, and they were more involved into antisocial behavior. So, but then with the sports, they were engaged into it, and it actually have something to do with it. So they said, and there was one of the comment that we found, like, and like same kind of comment that we actually, when we find, like, they were like, people were saying that it's actually helped them to divert, like either round by friends, families or families. I used to hang out with in down the streets, but I don't do it no more, because now they were diverted. And incentives, because some intervention pay for training fees, fitness centers across, and coaching program. That's a qualitative. Then when it comes to barriers and facilitators to achieving an outcome, we also see what's the success factors of sports intervention, the qualitative. It's like it's good relationship with the coach. As I said, like qualitative synthesis actually said in the findings that there was a good relationship with the coach. We don't get that evidence from effectiveness studies, but then qualitative supports them. And also structure pathways. The program supports positive youth development, ensuring that the program offers activities which match the child needs also. What were the barriers that we find it, like they could not able to achieve the outcomes of the intervention, like engaging with antisocial peers, reverse gain. They were stereotyping that by those in authority or the community more generally, that the children who are a bad behavior actually more engaged to. Initial resistance from the participants, lack of soft skills, as like the coach is not lost, and lack of support from family, or lack of transport. When we see the causal processes, which actually helps us to understand how this actually helped in achieving the outcome of this reviews, like causal, like, so there was a diversion that we said, like time use. Role of a coach, that coach has actually played a very good role in sports intervention, and then help the youth not to engage into antisocial behavior. And positive pathways, they were also connected to different services, basic education. They were also connected to getting an employment. And then incentives that they get, life skills, they also get friends. They were saying they don't have much friends now, they have a good friendship because they're playing sports together. Mental health, it helps their mental health. They help them to regulate their aggression, control their aggression, self-esteem. They build their confidence when they're playing the sports. So all this have actually supported it. But diversion in the role of coach is like one of the two causal pathway. We got it from a qualitative synthesis, which strongly support that the division and the role of the coach has played a good role in improving, not like in reducing the antisocial behavior among youths. So we only got 2 studies which talked about the cost effectiveness, and they said that it's a cost effective interventions rather than engaging youth into delinquent and then charging them. It's like these sports intervention is actually helps in reduction in reoffending. So the program is overall is cost effective. When we say the implication for this, like what we find is like we actually need a lot of high quality review, especially the effectiveness studies, so that we can strongly say that the effects of the intervention is very, because we have a high quality studies. And then sports intervention is cost effective, but we only got 2 studies included in that review. So if we have a more cost effectiveness studies, it actually helps into like policy relevance, because it's so that we can support that this sports intervention is very cost effective. We got no evidence from South Asia countries. And then sports intervention is, we said it's effective in reducing the antisocial and offending outcome, but there are very small number of studies. We see 6, 8 studies which say, and the point is that when it comes to critical appraising, it's like it's a low confidence. Even though our review identify many facilitators and barriers, which can actually help when you implement the sports intervention. So our qualitative synthesis gives that like these are the barriers and facilitators why youth are not engaged or children are not engaged into sports intervention. So if you make such changes into your intervention, you can actually replicate to the areas with high risk youths, and especially custodial settings, because we only got 3 papers which are from the custodial settings. There's a less evidence from sports plus intervention. We don't get much studies from sports plus intervention. They were like more majorly from the sports and the physical activities. We also like more outcome needs to be like time use and long run effects, because there were not much follow-ups happen. That's from my side.
Thank you very much, Suchi. That was really helpful. If anyone had any questions for Suchi, please put them in the chat. Moving on to our next presentation by Ashima now on wilderness and outdoor therapy interventions.
Thanks, Suchi, and thanks, Nayyara. Just let me share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is. It's just maybe you can enlarge it a little bit, put it in slideshow mode. Yeah,
is that
yeah,
okay?
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm going to be talking about the effectiveness of wilderness and adventure therapy interventions in reducing antisocial and offending behavior in children and young people. So these are the research questions that the review addressed: the long and short-term effects of wilderness therapy and adventure therapy and on antisocial and violent behavior and other offending behavior, as well as intermediate outcomes such as mental health outcomes, pro-social behavior, and self-regulation. We also looked at barriers and facilitators and cost effectiveness of these interventions as compared to other forms of treatment. The population that the target population was used up to aged up to 25 years, and the interventions that we included were that the program should be an organized activity. It should be a wilderness and adventure therapy intervention targeted towards children and young people who display antisocial and who are at risk, antisocial behavior and who are at risk. So these are the outcome categories that we analyzed: offending outcomes, all offending outcomes, externalizing and internalizing behavior, social behavior and mental health outcomes, and attitudes and beliefs, and as also academic outcomes. So the search strategy gave us 6,032 studies in which 92 were duplicates. The number of records screened were 5,940. Then we included 930 studies for full text screening, and from that we finally included 107 studies for coding, out of which the final included studies were 66 studies, out of which there were 47 effectiveness studies, 19 process evaluations, and 4 mixed method studies. We excluded 42 studies at the coding stage. So as you can see, mostly the studies were from North America. There were 55 studies from North America, and there were 42 effectiveness and 32 process evaluations from there. Then the next were from East Asia and Pacific. We found there were very few studies from Europe and Central Asia, and all studies were from high-income countries, all 66 studies. This is just like a kind of repetition of the last slide. Mostly the studies are from the US, and followed by New Zealand, 2 from Canada and Israel, 1 from Australia, and we found 3 studies from UK, 2 effectiveness and 1 process evaluations, and 1 was from Ireland, and 1 was from Singapore. So majority of the included studies had the age group of 10 to 14 and 15 to 17 years. There was also a kind of an overlap, like for example, some study, if they reported the age group as 13 to 16, then they were included in both these groups. So we identified 21 studies with offending outcomes and violence and crime outcomes. There were 13 studies which had outcomes like mental health, self-regulation, and externalizing behavior. 32 studies had internalizing outcomes such as self-esteem and identity development, 8 studies with skill development related outcomes, 11 studies with family and peer outcomes, and 8 studies with academic performance related outcomes. And yes, there are 2 studies that talked about cost analysis. I'll be discussing that later. So in the critical appraisal of effectiveness studies, 45 studies are rated as low confidence out of 46 effectiveness studies. The confidence level in the study findings is low because of attrition, lack of power calculations, or small sample size. For process evaluation, there were 19 process evaluations, and the 13 were rated as low confidence, and the main reason was that researchers' assumptions and biases were not outlined, and 5 were rated as medium and 1 was rated as high confidence. So So wilderness and adventure therapy interventions had small but significant impact on offending outcomes. This finding was based on a large number of studies. However, all of them were low confidence. There were large and significant effects on attitudes and belief, education, and internalizing and externalizing behavior outcomes, again with low confidence in study findings. Qualitative evidence also confirms effects on self-esteem and social behavior. I'll be discussing that later. There were large and significant findings in mental health and social outcomes as well, but low confidence in study findings. Both quantitative and qualitative analysis suggest that the effects are unlikely to be sustained after the intervention. So we also conducted a moderator analysis, and a number of moderators were quoted to explore possible reasons for heterogeneity. And these moderators were time of follow-up, gender of the participants, ethnicity, and type of control group used in the evaluation. So I'll discuss the time of follow-up moderator. This was coded as a continuous variable in years, where the time 0 was represented as the immediate post-intervention data. Hence, time 0.5 represented a follow-up time point 6 months after the end of the intervention. So a meta-regression was performed to examine the relation between the time follow-up and the mean effect size. And the results here show that the offending outcomes were followed up on average for the longest amount of time, followed by externalizing behavior. However, overall, the effects of wilderness and adventure therapy were not sustained, because the unit of time follow-up increased the mean effect size for the impact of the intervention that reduced. So publication bias was carried out using the Eggers test. A statistically significant coefficient suggests that publication bias is present in the study findings, especially for the internalizing behavior outcomes. So we move on to the qualitative findings now. So the barriers to participation were mainly attrition and not joining or dropping out. There were various reasons for that, like the intervention dates clashed with another activity. They did not get permission from parents. They suffered health problems. There were behavior problems that were faced by the program organizers, like if the participant maybe is physically present, but they have a manipulative behavior, and they are sort of bringing down the other participants as well. Physical and health issues were faced by a lot of participants due to bad weather. They could not take part because of illness. The camping and the hikes took a toll on some participants' health. The facilitators for participation were group cohesion and peer support, which is like kind of the key element for the causal process here. And it encouraged the participants to stay motivated and stay in the program and help each other. So nurturing and supporting staff, well-trained. So the counselors are also key in the causal chain, like counselors should be approachable and should be willing to help. So that sort of adds a lot to in terms of reaching out and helping the participants and helping them gain confidence by doing these trust exercises. Relationship building, friends. So there was a study where friends attended the program together, and they sort of encouraged each other to participate and take part in the challenges as well, challenge activities. So it sort of increased and strengthened their bond. So barriers to outcomes would be inability to transfer the learning. So a lot of participants felt that all the things like self-esteem and feeling valued that they sort of achieved in the program, they were not able to sustain. Like they were very kind of skeptical if they'll be able to sustain these effects once they go back home, once they go back to their school, once they join the society again. So most of them were not very confident about sustaining these sort of impacts. Also gender dynamics. So there is a program where most of the participants were victims of sexual abuse. So they didn't want to be in a mixed gender program because they didn't want to discuss their experiences with men or with young boys. And short-term programs, of course, cannot expect a long-run impact. They sort of do not influence positive change to a great extent. So facilitators to outcomes would be the participants gaining emotional maturity, and they are able to, they sort of get a platform to express themselves, express emotional turmoil and associate feelings of conflict by sort of immersing themselves in the program and soaking up all the aspects, like taking help from the counselors, taking part in group activities, and sort of reconstructing their personalities. Providing opportunities to for family intimacy. So there are a lot of programs, a couple of programs that also involve the families of the participants, and it it showed that they were more effective, like as a family endeavor, and they were able to sit and talk with each other and discuss their issues and with their families, because the most after they go back, the most impact is seen with families. So there were two studies which demonstrated the cost that wilderness programs are a bit more cost effective than the regular residential programs or the regular regular residential or regular programs where the youth are incarcerated. So there is the Nokomosis challenge program, which said that the cost reduced by there was a saving of $17,600 per year as compared to a correctional residential facility, and same was with another wilderness program. So one of the limitations of this review is the small size of the evidence base, assessing long-term impact of wilderness programs on antisocial behavior and offending. There is a need for further studies on wilderness and adventure interventions, particularly ones incorporating different sort of design features, such as combining multifamily group work with adventure therapy, to test the effectiveness of follow-up support to sustain the effects of wilderness and adventure therapy programs. Thank you. That's it for me. I'll just hand over to Monisha now.
Thank you very much, Ashima. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions for Ashima and for Suchi on the sports intervention and the outdoor and wilderness adventure therapy interventions, please do put your questions in the chat. Handing over to Monisha now for mentoring interventions.
Thank you, Nayyara. Thank you, Ashima. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, yes, it's fine.
Thank you. Today, I will present the significant findings of a mixed methods meta-analytic systematic review on mentoring interventions for youth at risk for offending or those who have already offended. This review has been funded by the UK Endowment Fund, UK. This slide is an overview of the systematic review. It explains the objectives of the review. The first objective assesses the evidence on the effects of adult mentoring programs in reducing antisocial, violent, and offending behavior in children and youth. The second objective focuses on particular aspects or features of adult mentoring programs. The third objective relates the barriers and facilitators to participation and outcome. And the last objective relates to cost effectiveness. The population for the review is youth aged up to 25 years who have exhibited or deemed at risk and for offending antisocial and violent behavior. And in terms of intervention, we include all adult mentoring interventions, which could be meaning studies with mentoring only interventions and studies with multi-component mentoring interventions, where mentoring interventions could be primary or secondary. This is the theory or visual representation of our theory of change. We use the mid-level theory of change, and that was rooted in the strengths-based paradigm. However, due to paucity of time, today I will be focusing on the findings of our review. The findings of our review test the applicability of theories such as the solution-focused theory, the labeling theory, social learning theory, and activity theory, to name a few. This is the prisma of the review. It shows the number of records we included and excluded at different stages of the review. We started the title and abstract screening with about 2,900 records. We were left with 284 studies at the full text stage. A majority of the studies were excluded at the title and abstract stage itself because they did not target children and youth who had already offended or were at risk for offending. We were left with 119 records during the coding stage, of which we excluded 7 studies because they were before versus after studies with no comparison group. And finally, we have included 112 studies in this review, of which 89 studies are cost effectiveness studies and 33 studies are process evaluation. Talking about the components of the mentoring programs included in this review, over 50% of the studies assess adult mentoring interventions, target only mentoring interventions. Our review also includes multi-component mentoring interventions. Multi-component mentoring interventions could be mentoring as a primary intervention and mentoring as a secondary intervention. So close to 1/5 of the studies report multi-component interventions. About 1/10 of the studies do not report the components of the mentoring program. Structure here refers to the extent of direction. So over 50% of the programs were highly structured and about over 1/10 of the programs were moderately structured. Discussing the mode of delivery, the individual mode of delivery was most popular. It was reported in about 3/5 of the studies, and about 1/10 of the studies had group mentoring interventions, and a considerable number of studies, that is about 1/4 of the studies reported combined, that is individual and group combined mentoring interventions. This slide shows the duration, the frequency, and the length of mentoring interventions. Talking about duration, close to 50% of the studies lasted between 6 months to 24 months. About 1/4 of the studies lasted between 6 to 12 months. And in about 1/5 of the studies, duration was not reported at all. In terms of length of the mentor-mentee meetings, a vast majority of the studies did not report the length of the mentor and the mentee meetings. 1/4 reported that mentor-mentee meetings lasted for over 2 hours. About 1/10 of the studies reported that the meetings lasted between 1 to 2 hours or less than 1 hour. In terms of frequency, again, majority of the studies failed to report it. A little over 1/4 of the studies reported that meetings took place once a week. And in about 1/5 of the studies, it was reported that the meetings took place more than once a week. Here are the key professionals involved in mentoring interventions. The most common key settings involved in mentoring interventions. The most commonly reported settings are communities and schools. The others in this table refers to the juvenile justice centers, the detention centers, and prisons. This table shows the key professionals involved. Volunteers, teachers, paid mentors, social workers are the most commonly engaged professionals, and the others here in this table refers to key members of the local communities, field level health workers, educational coordinators, project coordinators, and paid foster family members. We assess the confidence of the studies being included in this review. So this table shows the results of the critical appraisal of the effectiveness studies. So a vast majority of the effectiveness studies, that is over 90% of the included effectiveness studies, were rated as low confidence. We had about 3 studies were rated as medium confidence and 7 studies were rated as high confidence. A large number of studies were rated as low confidence owing to an absence of power calculations in these studies. For process evaluations, again, a majority of the studies, that is over 80% of the studies, were rated as low confidence. I think it is important to remember here that the evaluation is based on what the study authors say they did. So a result that is a low rating could indicate a failure to report rather than a problem with the study itself. So overall mentoring interventions mostly had a desirable impact on the outcomes included in the present review. So the results of random effects meta-analysis suggest that mentoring interventions reduce all offending, crime, recidivism, substance misuse, external behaviors, and improve peer outcomes, familial outcomes, academic and school-related outcomes. So this table presents a summary of the weighted mean effects for each of the outcomes reported in the present review. So the positive rows indicate, the green rows indicate positive effects, and the rows that are color-coded in orange indicate that there is a positive effect, but it is not statistically significant, and the rows that are color-coded in red indicate an undesirable effect. Here are the forest plots for offending-related outcomes. This figure shows the forest plots for violence-related outcomes. And finally, this figure shows the forest plot for observed effects for crime outcomes. So we use the Eggers regression test to assess the possibility of publication bias in each of the meta-analysis. So this test assesses the relationship between the observed effects and the standard error. And if the relationship is statistically significant, then asymmetry is present. Here, if the asymmetry is present, this is considered an indication that a publication bias is present in the meta-analysis. In these tables, red rows indicate the likelihood of publication bias from our results. Here we have the findings from the moderator analysis. So examples of some of the moderators are age, gender, ethnicity, structure, and frequency. So I will now discuss some of the significant findings from the moderator analysis. So talking about the level of risk for offending, we found that individuals at high risk for offending reported greater reductions in crime activities, violence, behavioral outcomes, internalizing behavior, and substance use. Regarding structure of mentoring, we found that highly structured mentoring interventions showed the greatest increases in behavioral outcomes, internalizing behaviors, and peer-related outcomes. Comparing mentoring alone versus mentoring plus other component interventions, that is mentoring interventions compared to mentoring interventions which provide additional components, we found that mentoring alone interventions significantly increased attitudes, beliefs, peer outcomes, behavioral outcomes, and led to greater reductions in violence. And talking about mentoring component for interventions with multiple components, interventions where mentoring was the primary component compared to interventions where mentoring was secondary was more successful in reducing the levels of crime activity, substance use, violence, and externalizing behavior. Frequency, regarding frequency, we found that a higher frequency of mentor-mentor meeting led to greater reductions in crime. We'll now move on to the qualitative results of the review. The qualitative results of this review are organized into barriers and facilitators to participation and barriers and facilitators to outcomes. In order to extract the qualitative data for this review, we used the TBSR matrix, and this matrix allowed for not only allowed for flexibility, but also helped us to extract the data in a comprehensive and meticulous manner. So I will now read out the various themes under barriers to participation. The various themes that we identified, the major themes that we identified under barriers to participation are mentor and mentee hesitancies, limited mentor availability, recruitment processes of mentors and mentees, matching of mentors and mentees, failed expectations, volunteer dropout, judgmental approach, fear of law enforcement authorities. This could be seen in studies when police officers or probation officers were incorporated into the delivery of the mentoring programs. Additional after-school mentoring. In many cases, mentoring delivered at additional after-school mentoring programs were perceived as a burden by the children as an additional after-school exercise and did not attract the attention of many of the participants. Harassment and disrespectful behavior towards student mentors, issues of trust and confidentiality. We also have some sub-themes under the recruitment processes of mentors and mentees, which include rigid prerequisites, non-awareness of service referrals, and challenges relating to mentor induction. Talking about matching issues or issues of compatibilities, one of the mentees stated, I quote, "I was surprised to be matched with Christina after being told so many times that I would be matched with someone who had similar interests as myself. While I enjoyed having Christina as my match, things have been difficult at times, as she was very different. She has a very different opinion as to what is fun than I do. I'm a very active person, and she prefers to stay indoors. I enjoy sports, and she prefers computer games. I feel that the program should be more forthcoming in the matching activity." Here are the various themes under facilitators to participation. The various themes are mentor characteristics or qualities, targeted recruitment, training of mentors, mentoring relationship, blending mentoring with other interventions, mentors donning various hats, well-matched mentor and mentee. The various sub-themes under mentoring relationship include phases of the mentoring relationship, unconditional bond between the mentors and the mentee, trust, reciprocity, relationship based on respect rather than authority. The various sub-themes under mentors donning various hats are mentors as role models, mentors as guides, mentors as confidence builders. Talking about mentoring qualities, one of the mentees said, I quote, "I attempted suicide a lot, about 7 times. A few months before my mom's passing and a few months after. This was really a dark time in my life. So he basically saved me. He cares so much about me."
Manisha, sorry to interrupt. I think if you could wrap it up in the next minute or so. We just have a few minutes left.
Yeah, sure.
We also have a couple of questions that we've got in the chat. Would like to address those and take those up in the Q&A session. If you could wrap this up quickly, that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Nayyara, sure. Talking about well-matched mentor and mentee or perfect matching, one of the mentees said, I quote, "I'm thrilled at how fantastic the match was accomplished. From day one, Kesha and I have been like two peas in a pod." We also identified various themes under barriers and facilitators to our. So the various themes that were identified under barriers to outcomes are mentee activity attenuation. So it was found that the participation of the mentees gradually decreased over the course of the mentoring program, grappling with mentoring complexities. In many studies, mentors felt overwhelmed. They were not prepared for the complexities of mentoring interventions. There were issues relating to communication, leadership, location, funding, transportation, the duration of the mentoring program, and poor management of termination. The poor management of termination was a key theme under barriers to outcomes. And in many cases, mentees felt cheated and the mentees were left scarred when the mentors left them suddenly. They felt abandoned. And talking about the various themes under the facilitators to outcomes are buy-in from teachers and other members of the school community in after-school program, the long-term duration of the mentoring programs, providing financial incentives throughout the course of the mentoring programs, involving parents and caregivers into the mentoring programs, having a healthy relationship between the mentor and the mentee, and practicing planned or formal termination of the mentoring relationship.
Manisha, I think we have a question on the mentoring review. If you could maybe answer that question. From Com Walsh, the question is, could you briefly describe the outcomes in the mentoring review?
Yeah, sure. This is my last slide. So I have, in the end, I have a slide on mentoring outcomes. So I'll just show that and explain the various outcomes. Can I do that in a minute?
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. So here we have the findings from this table provides the overview of the cost findings. And here we have information relating to cost effectiveness, cost per participant, total cost, and the cost involved. And we've converted all costs into Great Britain pounds and presented it into this table. And These are the implications for research and policy from our review. I will be skipping this slide considering the paucity of time we have today. And to answer the question on outcome categories, here are the various outcome categories of the review. I could not explain this in the presentation due to paucity of time. So we have we had 3 outcome categories: offending outcomes, child-centered outcomes, family and peer-related outcomes, and school-related outcomes. And under each of these outcomes, we had subcategories, and they're shown in this figure.
Thanks, Monisha. That's really helpful. I don't know, Com, if that answers your question. If you have any, do let us know now. We also thanks Monisha on this. Malcolm says, thank you. It's difficult to see the detail of the slide, but look forward to seeing the presentation slides. I'm sure we can send out the presentation slides later. There was another question. I think that's directed towards all of the reviewers. A question from Hikari, and he says, thank you for the interesting presentation. I don't have much background knowledge on this topic and wonder why the vast majority of evidence comes from high-income countries. Is this that youth offending is a lower priority issue for middle or low-income countries? Thank you. Would anyone like to answer this question? Maybe Suchi or Monisha or Ashima?
Yeah, so maybe I can just go first, and then maybe we can just like others can remember. So like what happened, I agree, we like in terms of our inclusion and exclusion criteria of all these reviews, they're like we've actually like it's not we have not excluded any review based on the countries. Like we have actually included all the evidence available on this like sports interventions in low middle income countries or high incomes in any, like we actually want to see the effects of the interventions. But what happened when we see the evidence, which is like in my review in sports, there were 1160 studies and 54 were from like from high incomes. Like, and then there were only 6 studies that we got from a lower and middle income countries. So that's basically from South Korea. And then, so it's not about that they are like the youth offending is not a lower priority issue in Lumen. It's actually because there is no, like there was not much studies happen in those areas, even though the intervention would be there. Like in South Africa, they were like a boxing intervention in sports, which is like a fight with insane programs, and China also have it. There will be intervention, sports intervention, which is for, but then it has not been, there was not much studies on based on it. Maybe I think so Howard wants to say something. Like I just hand over to Howard.
Thanks. Over to you.
Okay, let me just come in on that one specifically. So if you look across these intervention categories, we've got sports, wilderness and mentoring. It's particularly sports programs are common in developing countries, but particularly they're sports for development programs. And so they are aimed at positive youth development. They're not really aimed at youth offending. There are sports for development programs in post-conflict settings. So they work with former child soldiers and so on, but we actually deliberately excluded those because it's not offending in the same context as it is in developed countries that would be of interest to YEF. So there are no actual good reviews for sports for development. I think that'd be a nice area for a review. But wilderness interventions is something that's not done. And maybe in Latin America, we didn't include Spanish literature. Again, mentoring is not done, maybe in Latin America. What I predict is you will see an increase in a focus on youth violence, gangs and so on in developing countries in the coming 5 to 10 years. And that will lead to a growth in the literature in these areas, but it's not there right now, but it's going to come. It's going to be one of the next big things.
Yes.
Thank you, Howard. I don't think we have time for any more questions. So I think it's time to wrap our session today. Thank you to all the presenters. This was such a great session. And thanks for the thought-provoking questions. It was really valuable to hear people's opinions and takes on the different ways we do the systematic reviews. We'll be using the findings from these reviews to update our YEF toolkit, and the reviews will also be freely available on our website. We are trying to think at the moment of funding more new systematic reviews, on effectiveness of various interventions to prevent youth violence. So if you do have any new ideas for research on systematic reviews, please do get in touch with me. Hope this was a very useful and informative session for everyone. Just want to flag quickly that Campbell's next webinar is on the 28th June, and Yashika asked me to raise that with the audience today. So hope you'll come and attend the next webinar as well. So thank you very much. Thank you and see you next time.